Hey folks, and welcome to the third episode of Southwestern College Podcast. I'm Luke Cuddy with the Philosophy Department, and I'm here with my colleague Peter Bolland. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute here. But on this podcast, we're just going to discuss sort of a belief system that stems from the Hindu tradition called Advaita Vedanta that isn't discussed too often in the Western world, and we believe it should be discussed more. We're going to talk about a concept called non-dualism, which is sort of central to this tradition, as well as the difference between what they call the true and the false self in that tradition. And so without any further ado, I'll kick it off to Peter. Peter, what's non-dualism?
Hey Luke, thanks for having me. This is such a treat to get to be a part of this growing podcast. I mean, it's about time that we did something like this. So thank you for your leadership on that. So yeah, non-dualism is a word that it's an English translation of a word that does come out of ancient India, like the Upanishads and the Vedas before that, and it's also a huge idea in Buddhism. And so to understand non-dualism, it's probably best to start with dualism, or what duality means. And these words sound sort of strange, but it's not that complicated, really. Dualism is the word for the Western worldview, largely. The religious philosophies of the Judeo-Christian Islamic belief system, namely that reality is two things. Like the human being, for example, is a physical body and a non-physical soul. Or the way the philosopher Descartes did it was, there are two realities of the mind and the body, and those two realities are in many ways completely separate, but they touch, and they're governed by different laws and so on. And so this idea that reality is two things is called dualism, and it's integral to the Western worldview. And what's so curious is that in India, a long time ago, 3,000 years ago or whatever, they arrived at a kind of different conclusion, namely that yes, there is a multiplicity of manifestations. There is matter, there is energy, there is consciousness, and so on. There is all this variation, but those are all sort of waves on the surface of an underlying single reality that in Sanskrit is called Brahman, and that is the view called non-dualism, meaning there's only one reality, and all forms, all energy, and all consciousness are outpicturings or manifestations of that one underlying reality. And if you try that view on, like trying on glasses, if you look at the world through that view, everything changes.
Yeah, absolutely, and maybe that's a good segue into that. One of the reasons that I really like this system of Advaita is that it focuses on the experience of non-dualism. It's not just an intellectual understanding, and I think sometimes Western philosophies get bogged down in the intellectual side. So with Advaita, as Peter put it, if you sort of put on your Advaita glasses and you see the world that way, it changes a lot. But one of the problems is it's hard to see the world that way. It's so easy to slide back into dualism. Okay. It's so easy to think of yourself as a separate being, a separate entity. And that's one of the reasons why traditions like Buddhism, which represents this view, and Advaita emphasize the experience of meditation. Because you have to kind of constantly reach in and remind yourself that you are one with everything, that you are part of this underlying fundamental reality. And the world is just constantly telling you you're not. I mean, people are telling you that you have separate personality traits, and you're a good person, and you need to do this and that. And it's not like that's bad, but it does sort of prevent you from seeing that you could be connected to anything else.
That's right. So the illusion of separateness, it doesn't just come from society or from our acculturation. It comes from our own experience. Buddhism has this idea that it really comes from the Buddha himself, called the Five Skandhas, the five sort of heaps or clusters of experiential waves that right. trick you into thinking you're a separate thing. And the first one is the fact that you have a body, and right. it's so obvious that my body is not your body or anybody else's body. So that form, the world of form, if we don't reflect on it too deeply, it really does seem like there's all these different things. And the second one is perception. We have all these perceptions, and I don't have your perceptions, I only have my own, and perceptions and body kind of go together. So those two things create the illusion of separateness. And then you add on that the what Eckhart Tolle calls the thought stream, all the concepts, the names, and that we give, all the ideas that just never end. And so and we'll leave the last two off, but I mean all those things, what the Hindus call Maya, creates this pervasive, persistent distortion that without meditation, if we just stop with everyday experience, we would conclude, as Descartes did, that we live in a world of forms and things, and other philosophers as well. So you're right. The bottom line with this, in this Advaita Vedanta perspective or Buddhist perspective, is that the simple, actual, quite simple way out of this is the meditative practice, because in meditation you finally slow down enough and get still enough to where you begin to witness the five skandhas. You witness the illusory nature of thought. You begin to realize you are not your thoughts. You are the boundless spaciousness in which thoughts arise and fade.
Yeah.
The way Eckhart Tolle puts it is, he says Descartes really did us a disservice by marrying together thought and the self.
Yeah.
I think, therefore I am, and Descartes said that's such an important part of the dualistic view. But for the meditative path, we say it a little differently. I think we say, well, thoughts happen, but we don't identify with thoughts.
Right. And it's not that thoughts are inherently bad. It's okay to think about the way. So I study with an Advaita teacher named Francis Lucille, who's up in Temecula. And I mean, he often emphasizes that, hey, look, if you're there's good thoughts and bad thoughts. If you're a physicist and you come home and your equations are still running through your mind, that's a good thought. You don't have to worry about that. Just let it happen. That's natural. But if you're having a thought about I should have been this or should have been that, or a more negative thought, then that could be more harmful. But even a negative thought, I mean, rather than get attached and feel guilty about it, just let it happen, right? According to the Advaita perspective.
So one of the things that happens in non-dualistic perspectives is the relationship between good and evil changes.
Yes.
Because in the West, where you have duality, you have deeply embedded dualisms in the religious and philosophical traditions, so that, and this is, we could talk about the historical roots, like this sort of comes out of a Persian tradition called Manichaeism. And
sure.
that has a big impact on Augustine and the way he then frames Christianity in the 4th century. And so you have this idea that there are these two metaphysical entities called good and evil. There's a duality, right?
Yeah.
And then in sort of classic medieval Christianity, the whole material world, including our bodies, gets kind of tainted as a fallen, less valuable, less sacred realm than the realm of the soul. And Paul even talks about this in his letter to the Romans, that my soul longs to be with God, but my body pulls me into this lower realm. So that whole biblical hierarchy, with all of the ramifications about that, the denigration of nature, and the fixation on good and evil. From a non-dualistic perspective, all of those things shift. And instead of talking about good and evil, we start to talk in terms of being asleep versus being awake, or ignorance versus wisdom. And people who do horrible things, or as you were mentioning a moment ago, negative thoughts, destructive thoughts like racism and bias, those are forms of unconsciousness. Those are forms of asleepness.
Right.
That from which, to put it in Buddhist terms, from which we must awaken.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that those thoughts wouldn't even, if somebody had truly sort of reached an experiential understanding of non-dualism, those thoughts would not arise. Sometimes people object to these sorts of views by saying, well, couldn't somebody just sort of game the system and learn how to control their thoughts and then become even, a more master Hitler? But no, they couldn't, because if they reached that level of understanding, those thoughts would be meaningless. It'd be like a lion who's well fed looking at the mice playing nearby. There's no, what interest does he have in those, right? What interest would a person who has experienced non-dualism truly have in, taking over other people and taking over society?
Yeah, Pema Chodron, the great American Buddhist teacher, she talks about hooks that, we go to a meditation, we go to a retreat, spend some time with Francis Lucille or somebody, and begin to experience in our meditation practice some dawning freedom from the relentlessness of the thought stream and the suffering that it generates. But then life hooks you back in.
Right.
Because we have these bodies, and or your heart gets broken, or there's some disappointment, or you're just looking at the suffering of the world. It all seems so crushing sometimes, and you start to sort of feel defeated, or why bother, and that's that hook. And so it is. That's why they call it spiritual practice. You don't just like read an article and like, got it, right. I'm cool now. So we sit, we get back on the pillow and we sit every day because you want to build a new habit. You want to build a habit of at least an alternative to relentless thoughting all the time.
Right. Yeah, and that one of the things that really opened me up to Advaita when I first went to see Francis was I was able to see in my experience the concepts that he was teaching us. I was able to see in my meditation. For example, he taught about this difference between the true and the false self. And he said the true self, which he just calls consciousness, which is sort of like the ultimate level of reality that we can...
Like Atman or
like
Dharmakaya or something, all right?
Yeah, exactly. And the false self, of course, is just the ego, which is the sense of being a separate being, not just the feeling and sense you get of being a little person inside your head operating your body, but also all the beliefs and traditions and customs that have arisen to reinforce that. And so when I first started to meditate and my mind started to quiet down, I started to see especially as I practiced more and more, I started to see a separation. And I started to see that all these thoughts and emotions and feelings that were coming up weren't really part of who I was in the deep sense, the way that my consciousness was.
They were happening to you, not from you.
That's exactly right. They were happening, or you could put it, they were happening through consciousness. Right? Consciousness was the foundation through which everything was streaming. And, I had read about stuff like that before. Right. For 10 years before that, I'd been reading Eckhart Tolle and Krishnamurti.
Yeah. Or in the Bhagavad Gita, even going back a couple thousand years, where Krishna talks about the knower and the field, or the inner witness. Right. I like that. I often use that phrase when I teach meditation, to become the witness. Ramana Maharshi used to ask his students, who are you?
Right.
And just have his students meditate on that, and Adyashanti, a contemporary teacher, kind of shifts it, I think, to an even better question, which is, what are you?
Right.
And other teachers use questions like here's a good one to kind of dwell on when you go into your meditation. Who is meditating?
Right.
So those are all forms of the same kind of question that begin to, maybe drive a wedge between this false identification with the thoughts as being what we are. Yeah. It's just a remarkable experience. It's liberating, and it's far from demonizing thought, as you said, or demonizing ego. The last thing we want to do is declare war on the ego.
Yeah.
Deepak Chopra has a funny quote about that. He says, trying to destroy the ego is the ego's favorite game.
Right.
And it's like, it's just another struggle.
Yeah.
And Adyashanti talks about that a lot. That you can't move toward awakening unless you abandon struggle.
Yeah.
And when I teach meditation, again, I think the mistake all beginning meditators make is they read the Yoga Sutra or whatever, and they say, the classic definition of yoga is the cessation of the thought waves of the mind. so I must stop my mind.
Yeah.
And they sit there and they grit their teeth and they're like, I gotta not think. And of course they fail and they like, screw it, meditation's stupid, I quit.
Yeah.
And so to let people know, you know what, the mind's, it is the mind's nature to move. Activity is what the mind's nature is. It's like, you don't ask a river to stop flowing. That's weird.
Yeah.
So instead, there's that, I'm going to allow the thoughts to continue to rise and fall, but I'm not going to resist them or attach to them. And then finally, you begin to witness them the way you witness clouds in the sky, with a certain disinterest.
Yes.
Here comes an emotion, here comes a longing. And without demonizing the ego, because the ego is an essential tool.
Yeah, you need the ego.
You totally do.
It's a practical thing.
Just like your hand. You know, I often think of like, I don't want to chop off my hand. I need it. It's not a bad thing, but I don't let my hand run my life.
Yeah.
And so the same way, I don't want my ego to run my life. It's not very good at it.
The way Francis puts it is that it's kind of like the more you meditate and the more you experience consciousness or non-duality, it's kind of like your ego is a little dude you were in the ship with, and he gradually is floating away. So it's not like you don't care about him.
No.
He's still there, and he's never going to get outside completely, but it's you have a different relationship to your ego.
Yeah. And you know, when it's time to apply for a job or apply to a college and you start working on your resume, you better have some ego.
Yeah, right.
You know, if you want to start a band and compete with other bands for shows, you better have an ego. If you're going to audition for a play, if you're an actor, you better have an ego. You know, but you use your ego in the sense of play.
Yeah.
I'm going to play in the field of forms. I'm going to show up in the consciousness of service, use whatever talents I've been given to create whatever I can create, knowing that none of this is about me. That's what the Gita is so good about too, the Bhagavad Gita, to work without attachment to the fruits of work, and know that all work is service. And when you perform the work of your dharma, of your purpose, that is Brahman working through you.
Sure.
And then you're free.
It kind of reminds me, playing with the ego reminds me of the controversial teacher Osho.
Yeah.
You know, who a lot of people would say he wasn't truly spiritually enlightened, and I don't know how I feel about that entirely, because he did some pretty weird shit, to be honest.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he would argue he's just playing with his ego.
Right.
You know, he would, for example, I heard one story where he just said, all right, everyone get naked and start climbing trees, you know, at some retreat, and, you know, just to kind of...
I was there, man. No,
yeah.
No, I wasn't.
You were in the tree.
I wasn't there.
But
yeah, or his, you know, his fleets of Mercedes-Benzes or whatever.
Right,
It's just like, yeah, well, I'm just playing.
Yeah.
You know, this is all a game, and so why not play with the field of forms? And you're right, he's controversial, but spiritual teachers, that's a whole other blog. We'll do another one on that, because that's a minefield, isn't it?
Yeah.
Once you cast yourself as a leader in those kinds of things, that path is fraught with danger. So we'll leave that one alone.
Yeah, I want to mention one other thing that just came to mind was there was a movie a few years back where some Indian American guy pretended to be a spiritual teacher, you know, and he put on an accent but the whole movie was kind of about his path and about how the people who looked up to him kind of, you know, and how much he had harmed them, and how some people still got something from him even though he was full of it. And,
God, this guy's a sociopath.
Yeah, he was kind of.
That's really cruel.
Yeah, I mean, if I remember that movie,
I'll look for that. But
you're right. That's a whole nother topic. I wanted to mention one other metaphor from Francis regarding the false self and true self that he uses that I think is pretty instructive, and it's kind of interesting. He uses a thing of salad dressing.
Okay.
You know, like the old school salad dressing where the oil separates to the top and the vinegar's in the bottom when you're not using it. But when you shake it up to use it, it's mixed together. And so our lives, according to Francis, are lived kind of like shaken up salad dressing. If the vinegar is our ego and the oil is our true self.
That's a good analogy.
It's sort of all mixed up and messed up, and sometimes we experience true consciousness. Most of the time we're identified with the ego. Yeah. But as you meditate, it starts to separate. It starts to get still, and you can see the difference between the oil and the vinegar, likewise between consciousness and the ego. So that was something that really helped me when I was first practicing, to see that difference.
Something I was just reading the other day, again, this teacher, Adyashanti, Adyashanti, he did an interview, I think, for Tricycle magazine, that old Buddhist magazine, a long time ago.
Is that the one you posted?
Yeah.
That was a great one.
Wasn't that a great bit? And he was asked by the interviewer, what's the difference between a mystical experience and awakening? and it was an interesting, kind of a refined discussion. And I think the gist of it is this, that a mystical experience, which is a beautiful thing, whether you have it in nature, maybe you're outside of traditional religion, you're not particularly a theist, but you get it backpacking or surfing, or you have it at Mass or in the mosque as a Muslim or whatever. You have a mystical experience reading the poetry of Rumi, and you have this overwhelming sense of the beauty of everything and the oneness of everything. He says that's a little bit different than awakening, because that's still an experience,
right?
And it's you are still like pleasured by it, and it's full of kind of pleasant emotions and sensations, and it's necessarily short-lived and fleeting,
right?
And so that's still part of the phenomenal realm, and not really what say the Buddhists would describe as real awakening,
right?
Which is, or in the Advaita tradition, maybe a samadhi or something, where there is a kind of separation even from those experiences.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because Indian philosophy is not a monolith. It doesn't just show up with a clear dogmatic doctrine. There's great variation in India. There are lots of dualistic Hindu sects.
That's true.
And so it's really after Shankara, which is like 9th century or something, that he sort of revitalized the study in India of the Upanishads. The study of the Upanishads had fallen into obscurity. And Shankara is this enormously influential, he's like the Plato of India. Everything after Shankara has his stamp. And what he did was he kind of recast all of Hinduism as non-dualism. So that even all the endless bhakti devotion stuff, all these temples and gods, even all that is understood now in Hinduism as a kind of surface mythological personification of this underlying reality, and that the most illiterate villager in India understands, even though they haven't studied or know how to read or anything, they understand that in their devotion to the various local deities, underneath the surface all is one.
That's really interesting. I see. I have practiced Advaita with this teacher I mentioned, Francis, but I don't know much about the history, so I'm going to have to look into kind of that turning point.
It's an interesting thing. I was just reading about it this morning, kind of getting ready for this talk, and ended up ordering a couple of books on Amazon.
Nice.
Which aren't here yet, but one of them was like the history of Advaita or something, and I was just reading the first chapter and kind of went through that. It is an interesting story, because in our philosophy classes we always have this challenge, right, of like very briefly and quickly presenting very complex multiplicitous traditions.
Sure.
And Hinduism is a perfect example. It's just not a thing. It's a lot of paths.
Yeah.
And so you do your best to sort of honor the variety, and it's not that hard. You just go think of how many different ways there are of being Christian. I
know, I was just going to say, conversely, aren't there some early sects of Christianity that kind of could be almost seen as non-dual in a way?
Yeah, well, just the mystics in general. The Christian mystics, when you read the Christian mystics, or I should back up and say, when you read mystics of any tradition, they talk the same talk, and it's often non-dualistic. That's what got the Sufis in trouble with more Orthodox Muslims. That's what got the Christian heretics in trouble with their church, was they commit what in the Abrahamic faiths is called blasphemy. To claim for oneself the characteristics of God. Yeah. And that's what got Jesus killed, was to go around saying, I am God. You're not allowed to do that in a dualistic tradition, because God is God. Right. And you are a creature that God made, and to say that I am God is a capital offense. Right. And so when people like Jesus or Meister Eckhart or the famous Sufis start talking about, in very intimate terms, about their oneness with God, in very familiar terms, it's a huge threat to the dualistic structure. So that's another way in which I think non-dualism, or the non-dualistic perspective, isn't just Hindu or Buddhist. It's global, and it's fundamentally human. Yeah. And that's why meditation is so important, because this is one way to put it. It undoes millennia of evolutionary development where we just began to sort of fall asleep and we believed in our perceptions and our concepts.
Yeah.
And the worst crimes of humanity, of course, come out of this sort of racist nationalist consciousness where everything's divided up.
Yeah.
Not just divided, but there's a hierarchy.
Would you say it's worse now that, some people would make the argument that the division, the temptation to divide yourself into some sort of dualistic category is worse because we have the internet and we have these, people confirming their own biases on Facebook and they have nothing but white nationalist friends and, or Trump listening to only Fox News for 5 hours a day and then playing golf. I mean, would you say it's worse or?
Well, there's no doubt that our media structures now are exacerbating this problem. I have no way of assessing if it's worse or better. I think it's always been pretty bad.
I guess that's true. I mean, even back then, 2,000 years ago, you can get just as, see reality just as falsely.
Because you're just with the people you're with all the time.
That's true.
But now, even though we have this insanely amazing tool called the web, and we can just be, we can access infinite archives, we still end up sort of swimming in our own little private ideological pools, as we've all discussed, and so like any other tool, the internet is both imprisoning us and liberating us at exactly the same time.
Right.
We have to wield these tools for good, and
Yeah.
it's largely an inside job. You can't really blame the machine.
That's true. And after all, podcasts like this are an example of
Exactly.
I would like to say, the good parts of the internet. I'll let the listeners be the judge of that.
Right. We're trying. But no, it's just to open up these different possibilities. It's such crucial work that people have access to alternatives, that's all.
Yeah.
And it's very yin and yang. The shadow side of all these alternatives is you have these little backwaters, where people just read Breitbart or they just listen to Alex Jones. And those guys have huge audiences.
Yeah.
And the same on the left, the same in any place on the ideological spectrum.
There's a lot of talk about this group Antifa, and I guess I would probably argue their ideology is more sound, but their methods are not, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay, well, is there anything else you can think of you want to add, Peter, about anything we missed on non-dualism?
This is a great start.
Yeah, there's so much we could go into depth on.
I think this is a good way to kind of bring people in who might not know about these things, to let them know there's this whole amazing ancient landscape of thinking about thinking. It strikes me that Advaita Vedanta is a synthesis of psychology and philosophy and spirituality.
Yes.
And talk about integrating things back into one.
Right.
And I think we just live, for all the darkness that we all see in the news every day, we also, I believe, live in unprecedented times of opportunity. This is never before have we seen the global integration of all of these formerly disconnected fields. There's enormous work, really, for the last 40 years between, say, the Western medical sciences and meditation.
Yes.
John Kabat-Zinn and so many other pioneers who brought meditation into the hospital to work with pain management, and so it's just gone mainstream in a way. Everybody's saying namaste. Everybody's got a yoga mat. And so to me, this is good news, and how Vedanta came to America, and that's maybe we'll talk about that story on another day. But it's a huge part of world culture, and that to me is a good thing.
And one other thing I'd mention that you just reminded me is something I really like about Advaita is that it sort of gives you a deep introspective rational method that other traditions don't. And
it's scientific.
It's very scientific. So when you're meditating, you're looking at, well, what is this thought and what does that mean and how is this connected here and what is the sensations of pins and needles I'm feeling in my hand and how does, is this me? Is it not me? Yeah. And there's a very, analytic, scientific process of dealing with your experience and putting it into some sort of context that makes sense.
It's not dogmatic, it's investigatory.
That's right.
And you're the lead investigator.
Right.
And teachers are simply there to kind of set up the experience for you and help you avoid some of the pitfalls, but no one's telling you anything. You're touching down into the unimpeachable authority of your own experience.
Yeah.
And so it is fundamentally an analytical, rational, and again, it's funny how language works. It inherently de-unifies everything.
Yeah.
Because what happens in meditation really is all of those disparate fields are integrated into simply experience, analysis, heart, feelings, thought, everything. It's all working together. It gets woven back together.
Right. And it sort of makes me sad that more Western philosophers aren't into it, because it's such a great fit for the analytic tradition. You know, they're so analytical about...
Well, it's happening. You know?
It is. It's getting better. There's people who are interested.
Yeah.
But it's a match made in heaven for me. You know, when I came across Advaita and I had already studied philosophy, I said, man, I can use all this rational knowledge to cut through myself. And
right.
Literally.
Beautiful. That's it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. I guess we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Peter, for talking with me.
Appreciate it. It's fun.
All right.